I didn't knock. He never knocked. Victor Salazar walked into the library's back office like he owned it, because for 13 years he had owned everything that mattered. He set a photograph on the desk in front of the woman without a word. The photograph showed a boy, 12 years old, gray-blue eyes, standing outside an elementary school, backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unaware he was being watched. "Beautiful kid," Victor said, straightening his cufflinks. "Shame if something happened to him on the way home one afternoon." Nora Ellison's hands went still over the stack of children's books she'd been cataloging. She didn't breathe. She didn't move. She just stared at the photograph of her son, her Ethan, and felt the floor open up beneath 13 years of carefully constructed safety. "You have 48 hours to relocate," Victor said, his voice pleasant, the way a man sounds when he's already won. "Portland, Seattle, wherever. I don't care where you take the boy. Just make sure Damien Viscari never has a reason to come looking." He walked out without waiting for her answer, because men like Victor Salazar never needed to wait. If you've ever been forced to choose between the person you love most and the child you'd die for, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your country. I want to know how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because what happens next inside that library is going to change everything you think you know about second chances. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You will not see the ending coming. Part 1, The Gray-Blue Eyes. The Tuesday afternoon rain came in sideways off the Willamette, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just appears and soaks through everything before you've thought to care. Nora Ellison was shelving picture books in the children's corner of the East Side Community Library when she heard the front doors open behind her. Not the usual quiet push of a regular patron, but the firm, deliberate entry of people who clear a room before they walk into it. She didn't turn around right away. She'd trained herself not to react to sounds, not to flinch, not to look up too fast. 12 years of that training had made her good at it. She slid a copy of a book about wolves into its spot on the low shelf and reached for the next one in the cart. "Mom." Ethan's voice came from the history section, casual and unhurried, the way he talked when he was genuinely absorbed in something. "They've got 3 guys in suits by the door." Nora finally turned. There were 4 of them, actually. She counted automatically, another habit she'd never been able to break. 4 men in dark overcoats positioned at intervals across the library entrance like they were guarding a building that mattered. The library was not a building that mattered to people like that, which meant they were guarding a person. She saw him a half-second later. He was standing at the circulation desk talking to Margaret, the head librarian, who was nodding in that way she did when she was trying very hard to appear calm and was failing at it. He was taller than Nora remembered. That was the first thing. The second thing was that he stood the same way, weight slightly forward, like he was always half a second from moving. Damien Viscari. In a community library in Portland, Oregon, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nora made in 4 months of part-time work, talking to Margaret about a literacy foundation. Nora set the book down very carefully on the cart so it wouldn't make a sound. She needed exactly 3 seconds to assess what to do. She used them. Ethan was 15 feet away with his back to the room, completely absorbed in a thick volume about the Pacific campaigns of World War II. The exit to the children's program room was directly to her left. She could take him through it, out the side door, into the parking lot, into her car, and be gone before Damien finished his conversation with Margaret. She'd done harder things. She was 2 steps toward Ethan when Damien turned. Not toward her. He turned because one of his security men had said something quietly into his ear, and Damien turned to look where the man was pointing, and the direction the man was pointing was toward the history section where a 12-year-old boy had just pulled a second massive book off the shelf and was attempting to carry both of them back to his table. Ethan looked up when he felt the weight shift. He had that habit. He always looked up when something changed in the room around him, even when he was deep in a book. He'd been that way since he was small, alert without being anxious, watchful without being afraid. Nora used to think he got it from her. She had stopped thinking that a few years ago. He looked up, and Damien Viscari looked at him, and the 2 of them were separated by 30 feet of library carpeting and 13 years of absence. And the resemblance was so immediate, so total, so physically undeniable that Nora felt it like a fist to the sternum. Damien went completely still. The security man beside him said something else. Damien didn't respond. He was looking at Ethan's face, the straight line of his jaw, the slight crook at the bridge of his nose, the gray-blue of his eyes, a color that Nora had spent 12 years telling herself was just unusual genetics, just coincidence, just a trick of lighting on certain days. Ethan noticed the man staring. He did what he always did when adults looked at him too long. He nodded politely, shifted his books, and went back to his table. 12 years old and already more composed than most adults Nora knew. Damien turned then. He turned in a slow, deliberate arc, and his eyes found Nora before she could move, before she could breathe, before she could manufacture the expression of a woman who had never loved him and never run from him, and certainly was not currently standing in a children's library holding a picture book about wolves with her hands shaking. He looked at her for a long moment. His face didn't change. "Nora," he said. Just that. Just her name, quiet and flat across the empty space between them. Margaret looked between them with the expression of a woman who understood she had walked into something she was not equipped for. She gathered her clipboard and found a reason to be somewhere else with admirable speed. Nora made herself walk toward him instead of away. She'd learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do in a dangerous situation was show the exit mattered to you. "Damien," she kept her voice even, "I didn't know the Foundation was connected to you." "It isn't, officially." He watched her cross the room. "I try to keep my name off things." "I know." "You've been here 3 years." It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it like one. The library program needed someone. He looked at her without speaking for long enough that it became something else. Not a pause, but a reckoning. She'd forgotten how he did that. How he could fill silence with more weight than most people managed with a full conversation. "He yours?" Damien said finally. He didn't look toward Ethan. He didn't need to. "Yes." "How old?" "Damien." "How old, Nora?" She held his gaze. 12. The word landed in the space between them, and neither of them moved. One of the security men shifted his weight near the door. The library's heating system clicked on somewhere overhead. Ethan turned a page in his book. "I'm going to need a few minutes," Damien said, not to Nora, but to the man closest to him. And the security team redistributed themselves with the practiced efficiency of people who had been told to give their employer space many times before. Damien looked back at her. Up close, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before, the slight tension at his jaw. He was 41 now. He looked like someone who had been making very hard decisions for a very long time. "You didn't call," he said. "You didn't write. You didn't—" "I know what I didn't do. 13 years. I know." "Nora." His voice dropped a register. Not anger, something worse than anger. "I thought you were dead. For 4 months I had people looking. I thought something had happened to you." The picture books on the cart behind her were still waiting to be shelved. She focused on that detail because it was real and immediate and had nothing to do with the way his voice sounded when he said her name. "I couldn't tell you where I was." "Why?" "Because I couldn't." "That's not—" "Because someone made it very clear what would happen if I stayed." She said it quickly, before she could stop herself, before she could remember that this was not the right place or the right moment, or possibly the right lifetime. "That's all I can tell you right now, not here." He studied her. He'd always had that quality, the ability to look at a person and find the seam where they were holding themselves together. He'd done it to enemies in negotiations. He'd done it to her once, a long time ago, in a different version of their lives. "That boy," Damien said. "Please don't." "That boy has my eyes." "Damien." "And the mark behind his ear. I had it checked, on the drive over. I pulled it up, my mother's side of the family." "Stop!" Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Across the library, Ethan looked up briefly, then back down. "This is not the conversation we're having in the middle of a public library." "Then where are we having it?" "I don't know yet." "That's not good enough." "I know." She exhaled. "I know it's not. But that's where we are." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a card, plain white, just a number, and set it on the top of the book cart, right next to a copy of a picture book about a bear who couldn't sleep. "Tonight," he said, 8 o'clock. You pick the place. Somewhere public." A pause. "Somewhere he won't be." He held her gaze one more second, then walked toward Ethan's table. Nora's heart seized. Damien. But he just stopped at the end of the table and looked down at the books Ethan had spread out. Military History, Pacific Theater, 1942. Code-breaking operations in the North Atlantic. A thick illustrated volume on Roman siege engineering that Ethan had clearly been carrying around the library for 2 weeks because the spine was beginning to recognize his hands. Good taste, Damien said. Ethan looked up. Sir? The Bletchley book. Most kids your age don't know what that is. Ethan considered him with the careful, unimpressed assessment of a child who had learned to read rooms the same way his mother had, for different reasons he didn't yet fully understand. My mom says it's the most important story of the war that nobody tells right. Damien was quiet for a moment. Your mom's right. He moved on. He didn't look back at Nora. He walked to the door where his security team reformed around him like water finding a channel, and in 30 seconds he was gone, and the library was exactly what it had been before. Quiet, warm, smelling of old paper, and the particular piece of a place where nothing was required of anyone. Ethan went back to his book. Nora stood there with the card in her hand and couldn't remember picking it up. She told herself she wasn't going to meet him. She made dinner, pasta, the simple kind, because it was Tuesday, and Tuesdays were pasta, and listened to Ethan describe a naval engagement in the Coral Sea with a level of tactical detail that would have alarmed most parents and only made her feel, as it usually did, that peculiar mix of pride and helplessness that came with raising a child who was smarter than you in ways you hadn't anticipated. You're not eating, Ethan said. I'm eating. You've moved the same piece of pasta around your plate 4 times. She looked up. He was watching her with that quality he had, not suspicious exactly, more like genuinely curious about the data she was presenting. I ran into someone today, she said. An old acquaintance. It just caught me off guard a little. Who? Nobody you'd know. You're a terrible liar, Mom. I'm an excellent liar. I've been lying successfully for 12 years. He tilted his head. He did that when he was processing something. That's not really something to brag about. Finish your pasta. She called her neighbor Carol to sit with Ethan, told him she had a board meeting for the foundation, and was in her car and heading downtown by 7:45, the card from Damien on the passenger seat, like evidence of something she hadn't decided yet. She picked the restaurant on Burnside because it was public and loud and full of people who wouldn't care about anyone else's business. She got there first. She always got places first. And chose a table near the window with sight lines to both exits. Old habit. She ordered water. She didn't look at the menu. Damien arrived at exactly 8. He came alone, which surprised her. No security, or at least none she could see, which in his world might mean the same thing as having them everywhere. He sat across from her, unbuttoned his jacket, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent the last 4 hours deciding not to feel anything and hadn't entirely succeeded. The boy, he said. Tell me. She'd rehearsed 3 different versions of this conversation on the drive over. None of them had started there. You already know. Tell me anyway. She wrapped both hands around her water glass. Outside the window, the rain was still going, softer now, just a quiet persistence against the glass. His name is Ethan. He was born March 9th. He likes military history and chess, and he can name every Secretary of Defense since 1947, which I've decided is going to be either very useful or very concerning depending on how his life goes. She stopped, swallowed. He doesn't know about you. Damien said nothing. He knows his father wasn't in the picture. He's never pushed for more than that. She exhaled. He's an extraordinary kid, Damien, in ways I can't always take credit for. Damien's jaw moved. He looked down at his hands for a moment. Why did you run? I told you. Someone made it clear. Who? She looked at him across the table. In the restaurant noise around them, someone laughed at another table, and a waiter dropped something in the kitchen, and the city went about its Tuesday evening business completely indifferent to the fact that everything was about to change. Someone in your organization, she said. Someone who knew about us before most people did. Someone who wanted to make sure there was never a reason for you to have someone to protect. Damien's expression shifted. Something cooled behind his eyes. Tell me exactly what happened. So she did. She started with the photograph, not the one Victor had shown her in the library that afternoon, but the first one, the one from 13 years ago, slipped under the door of the apartment she'd shared with Damien's cousin while she was 8 weeks pregnant and still figuring out how to say the words out loud. She told him about the meeting, about the voice on the phone that was calm and reasonable and made it completely clear that a child was only as safe as its mother's choices. She told him almost everything. She didn't tell him the name. Not yet. Because if she told him the name, she knew what Damien Viscari would do with it, and tonight she didn't have a plan for what came after that. He listened without interrupting, which wasn't like the man she remembered, and she realized the 13 years had changed that in him. He'd learned to let information complete itself before he responded to it. Another thing he'd taught himself, or someone had taught him, in the long years she hadn't been present for. When she finished, the silence between them was different from the one in the library. The library silence had been shock. This one was something else, something older. "He grew up without me," Damien said. "He grew up safe." "Those aren't the same thing." "I know." Her voice didn't break. She was careful about that. "I know they're not." "Nora." He said her name the way he used to sometimes, when it was just the two of them, and there was no performance required of either of them. Was it worth it? She thought about Ethan's voice describing naval engagements over pasta, about the way he looked up in libraries when something changed in the room, about 12 years of Tuesday afternoons and school plays and fevers in the middle of the night when it had just been the two of them, and somehow that had been enough. "Yes," she said. "Every day, yes." Something crossed Damien's face that she couldn't name exactly. Not anger, not grief, not forgiveness. Something that contained all three without being any of them. He reached into his jacket. Nora tensed. He set his phone on the table. On the screen was a message from a private laboratory. She could see the logo, the letterhead. She could see, at the bottom of the visible text, a percentage. 998. "I had a sample run this afternoon," Damien said, "from the water glass he was using at his table." She looked at the phone. She looked at him. "I already knew," he said. "I needed the paper." Outside, the rain was picking up again. A cab moved slowly through the wet street, its light a smear of yellow against the dark. Someone at another table was celebrating something, a birthday maybe, or a promotion. And the sound of their laughter was ordinary and real and completely separate from the two of them sitting across from each other with 12 years of silence between them and a number on a screen that changed everything. "What happens now?" Nora said. Damien looked at the window for a moment, then back at her. "Now I figure out who sent someone to make sure I never found out I had a son." His voice was very quiet. "And then we have a different conversation." He stood. He put his jacket back on. He was almost to the door when he stopped and looked back at her, just once. "He's remarkable," Damien said. "You did that." And then he was gone, and Nora sat alone with her water glass and the sound of other people's laughter, and the slow, certain understanding that 13 years of careful hiding had just come to a permanent end. She drove home through the rain. She didn't know that in a parking garage 4 blocks away, 2 men in a gray sedan were already on the phone, telling someone that Viscari had found the woman and asking what they should do next. She didn't know the answer was coming faster than she could prepare for. She just drove home and checked on her sleeping son, and stood in the doorway of his room for a long moment watching him breathe, with the particular ache of a woman who understood, for the first time in a long time, that the walls she'd built weren't going to hold. Nora didn't sleep. She lay on top of the covers in her work clothes and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain work its way through the night in stages. First heavy, then scattered, then just the occasional drop falling from the gutters outside Ethan's window. She could hear him breathing through the wall. She'd kept that habit from when he was an infant, that particular alertness to the sound of him, and 12 years hadn't dulled it at all. At 2 in the morning, she got up and checked the locks. Front door, back door. The window in the kitchen that had a latch she'd always meant to fix and never had. She stood in the dark hallway between their 2 rooms and tried to calculate something she didn't have enough information to calculate. By 3, she was at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and her phone and the card with Damien's number, and she was thinking about Victor Salazar. She hadn't said his name. She told herself it was because she needed more time to decide, needed to understand what Damien would do with that information before she handed it over. But the truth, the actual truth she hadn't let herself examine directly, was that she was afraid. Not of Victor, or not only of Victor. She was afraid of what Damien's face would look like when he heard it, of what she would see in him when the name landed. She had spent 13 years not seeing that, and some careful, cowardly part of her was not ready to give that up. She poured the cold coffee down the drain and went back to bed and closed her eyes and didn't sleep. Ethan was up at 6:15 because he was always up at 6:15, which was one of many things about him that had not come from her. He made his own breakfast, cereal, methodically measured, with exactly the right amount of milk, and read while he ate, which he'd been doing since he was 8, and she'd long ago stopped trying to talk him out of it. This morning, it was a different book, something about Cold War intelligence operations, and she watched him read it from across the kitchen and felt the specific vertigo of seeing a stranger's qualities perfectly reproduced in someone she knew from the inside. "You look terrible," Ethan said without looking up. "Thank you." "Did you sleep?" "Some." He turned a page. "Carol said you got home after 11. Carol should mind her own business. Carol is 68 and lives alone, and we're her business." He finally looked up. He had that quality of attention that landed with actual weight. "What's going on?" "Nothing." "Mom." "Ethan, eat your cereal." He held her gaze for another second, then went back to his book. He didn't push. He never pushed. He just filed things away with that quiet, patient precision of his and waited to see if they became relevant later. She'd always thought that was a healthy quality. She was beginning to reconsider. She dropped him at school at 7:40, watched him disappear through the entrance without looking back. He'd stopped doing the parting wave somewhere around age 10, which had been its own small grief, and then sat in the parking lot for 3 minutes before she called Damien's number. He picked up on the first ring. "Did something happen?" he said immediately. "No, nothing happened." She pulled out of the lot. "I need to meet with you again, today. I can be at the library at—" "Not the library? He's not going to be at the library, and I don't want you near the library right now." A pause. "There's a coffee place on Morrison, blue awning, noon." A brief silence. "Are you going to tell me the name?" She hadn't said anything about a name. She'd said she had more information. He'd made the inference himself. "Noon," she said, and hung up. Victor Salazar called her at 9:47. She was in the library storage room cataloging a box of donated books. When her personal phone buzzed, and she looked down at the screen and felt her stomach drop clean through the floor. The number was one she'd deleted 3 times and memorized against her will. She let it ring once more. Then she answered. "You met with him." Victor's voice was the same as it had always been. Pleasant, unhurried, the voice of a man who scheduled his days in advance and felt no anxiety about any of it. Nora moved deeper into the storage room and pulled the door mostly closed. "I didn't have a choice." He walked into the library. "No, Nora. You had the same choice you always have. You just made the wrong one." He saw Ethan. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. In Victor Salazar's particular lexicon, 3 seconds was the equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. "How much?" he said. "He knows Ethan exists. He ran a test. He already has the results." She kept her voice flat and level, the way she'd trained herself. "This isn't something you can walk back. It's already happened." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing specific." "Nora." A different quality entered his voice, still pleasant, but with something underneath it now, something that had always been underneath it. "I've been very patient with you, for a very long time. I need you to think carefully about the next few choices you make." "Are you threatening my son?" "I'm reminding you of an arrangement that has kept your son safe for 12 years, an arrangement you appear to be reconsidering." "Victor, have a careful day." He hung up. She stood in the storage room with donated books stacked around her in uneven towers, and her phone in her hand and her heart doing something complicated and unpleasant in her chest. And she thought about the 48 hours he'd given her a lifetime ago, yesterday afternoon, in the back office where he'd laid a photograph of her son on the desk, like it was nothing. She thought about the 13 years she'd spent believing that the arrangement was holding, that the walls were holding, that distance and silence and a forged paper trail were enough. She called Damien back. "Move it up," she said when he answered. 11. "And bring someone you trust." "I don't trust many people." "Bring one of them." She got to the coffee place at 10:50. Damien was already there, which meant he'd been moving toward Morrison Street before she'd even called, which meant he'd anticipated the call. which meant he was still the same person she remembered in the ways that mattered most. There was a man with him she didn't recognize, compact, dark-haired, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the particular stillness of someone who had survived a long time by being underestimated. He sat one table away facing the door and did not look at Nora directly, which meant he was watching her in his peripheral vision with complete attention. Damien stood when she came in, which surprised her. She hadn't expected that. She sat across from him and put her phone on the table face up, her hands flat on either side of it. "Victor Salazar," she said. Damien's expression didn't change, not a flicker, not a shift. He just looked at her across the table with those gray-blue eyes that she saw in her son's face every morning and said nothing for long enough that she started to wonder if he'd already known. "How long has he worked for you?" she said. 18 years. His voice was completely even. "He's my consigliere. He came to see me yesterday, before you came to the library. He left a photograph of Ethan on my desk and told me I had 48 hours to relocate." Something happened then in Damien's jaw. A small tightening, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing you'd only catch if you'd spent time learning his face. "He knew I was coming to the library. He had to. He was already there first." The dark-haired man one table over shifted very slightly. Damien glanced at him. One quick look, a communication she couldn't fully read, and the man took out his phone and began typing. 13 years ago, Damien said. His voice was still even. Professionally, carefully even, like a man keeping his hands relaxed on a surface they wanted to grip. "He came to you. Not in person, a phone call first, then a man I didn't know, with a photograph. Then the phone call again, telling me what the photograph meant." She kept her eyes on him. "He knew I was pregnant before I told you. He knew before anyone knew. You were 8 weeks. I know when I was." Damien sat back in his chair. He looked at the window. The street outside was gray and moving. People, umbrellas, a bus going past. And he looked at it with the fixed attention of a man who was looking at something else entirely. "He told you I'd die trying to protect you," he said. "He said you'd sacrifice everything and lose anyway. He said the child would be leverage against you for the rest of your life. He said the kindest thing I could do for everyone, for you, for the baby, was disappear." She paused. "He made it sound like I'd be doing you a favor." Damien was quiet. "He was very persuasive," she said. "He knew exactly what to say. He knew what I was afraid of. He knew about the Calvetti threat that month. He knew about the men your uncle had lost in—" She stopped, watched Damien's face. "He knew things that only someone inside your organization would have known." "Yes," Damien said. "He would. I was 26. I was 8 weeks pregnant, and I was alone, and someone was telling me my child would be killed if I stayed." Her voice didn't change. She was past the point where her voice changing helped anything. "I believed him." "I know." Damien looked back at her. Something in his expression had gone very quiet and very hard in a way that reminded her, for the first time in a long time, of who he actually was and what his world actually contained. "You should have believed him. He was right that it was dangerous." A pause. "He was wrong about what I would have done." "I didn't know that." "No, you didn't." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the bus stop refilled with people. "He called me this morning," Nora said. "He knows you saw Ethan. He knows you've made contact with me." Damien's eyes moved to her. "What did he say?" "He reminded me of our arrangement. He called it that. Our arrangement." The word tasted bad in her mouth. "He sounded like a man who still thinks he controls this." "He does control things," the dark-haired man said from the next table, without looking up from his phone. His voice was quiet and precise, with an accent she couldn't immediately place. "He controls about 40% of our Eastern operations and has personal relationships with 3 of the 5 family heads we maintain agreements with. If he moves against Damien directly, he can pull enough support to make it a question instead of a certainty." Nora looked at him. "Who are you?" "Marcus." He still didn't look up. "I've worked for Damien for 11 years. "And you trust him," she said to Damien. "He's still alive," Damien said. "That's my version of trust." Marcus looked up then, and gave her a look that was as close to humor as his face apparently got. "It's a reasonable standard." Nora looked back at Damien. "What happens now?" "Now I have a problem I need to solve carefully." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table. An old habit. She remembered it suddenly, from a different decade, a different kitchen. Victor has been managing this organization's external relationships for nearly 2 decades. Half the agreements we hold exist because of his contacts. If I move against him without preparation, I lose more than him. So you do nothing. I didn't say that. He knows about Ethan, Nora said. The words came out harder than she'd intended. He had someone watching my son walk into a school building. I don't have the luxury of careful. Damien looked at her steadily. I understand that. Do you? Nora. His voice was quiet. Not gentle exactly, but quiet in the way something becomes when there's nothing left to perform. I found out yesterday that I have a 12-year-old son. I need approximately 1 more minute before I stop being careful about how I handle the man responsible for that. She held his gaze. Something in her chest that had been clenched since 2 in the morning very slightly loosened. 48 hours, she said. That's what he gave me. He gave you that to make you move. If you move, you become harder to locate, which makes Ethan harder to locate, which makes both of you less useful as leverage against me. Damien's jaw was very tight. He's not planning to let you relocate. He's giving you a clock so you make a mistake. The coffee in her cup had gone cold. She hadn't taken a sip. What do you want me to do? I want you to take Ethan out of school today, quietly. I want you to tell him it's a family thing, a trip, whatever works. I'm going to put you somewhere safe while Marcus starts pulling Victor's current positioning. Ethan will ask questions. What does he usually do when you give him incomplete information? She thought about the kitchen that morning, about the way he'd looked at her over his cereal bowl and filed away what she wasn't saying. He waits. Smart kid. Something passed across Damien's face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite grief. I'd like to meet him, properly. You already met him. I asked him about a book. He remembered what you said, about his mother being right. She watched Damien's face when she said it. He repeated it to me at dinner. Damien looked away. He looked at the window again, at the gray street and the people going past, and she could see something working in him that had no clean outlet. Does he know anything, Damien said, about who his father might be? He's never asked. That's not the same as not knowing. She thought about it, about the particular quality of Ethan's attention, about the books he chose, about the way he watched rooms. No, she said finally. It's not the same. She pulled Ethan out of school at 1:15. The school secretary gave her the look that school secretaries give parents who arrive mid-afternoon without prior notice. And Nora smiled the smile of a woman who was absolutely not dismantling a 13-year safety plan in real time and signed the release form and waited in the lobby. Ethan came through the hall door with his backpack and his Cold War book and took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" "Family thing. We're going to stay somewhere else for a few days." "What family thing? Our family is you and me and Grandma in Tucson, who we talk to twice a year." "Ethan." He studied her. The secretary was pretending to be interested in her computer screen. "Are we safe?" Ethan said very quietly. She looked at her son, 12 years old, standing in a school lobby with a book about intelligence operations under his arm, asking the exact right question with the exact right level of calm. She had no idea what to do with the fact that he was already this person. "Yes," she said. "Right now, yes." He nodded once. "Okay." He fell into step beside her. "Can I bring more books?" "We'll be near a library." "Which library?" She held the door open for him. "A private one, Bob." Damien's house outside Portland was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't known what to expect. It was large, but not ostentatious. A converted farmhouse on 12 acres, with old trees around it and a gravel drive that crunched under the tires, and a view of nothing but sky and hills from the main windows. There were 6 men she could count on the property, positioned with the practiced casualness of people who had been doing security for a long time and were good at making it look like something else. Ethan counted them from the passenger seat. 6, he said. "Don't point." "I'm not pointing. I'm counting." "Then stop counting out loud." He sat back in his seat. He'd been quiet since they left the school, processing in the way he processed, inward and thorough and patient. She had braced herself for questions all the way there, and he hadn't asked any, which was somehow worse. Marcus met them at the front door and showed them to 2 rooms on the 2nd floor. Nora's room had a window that looked over the main entrance. She noted that without saying anything about it. Damien came in an hour later. She heard his car on the gravel and heard the front door and heard voices downstairs. His, Marcus's, someone else's. And then footsteps on the stairs and a knock on the open door of the room where she was sitting. He looked tired. Not the way people looked tired when they hadn't slept. The way people looked tired when they'd spent several hours thinking through something that didn't have a good solution. Victor moved up his timeline, he said. She straightened. How do you know? Because 2 of the men on my security detail have been on Victor's secondary payroll for the last 18 months. Marcus found the transfers an hour ago. He came into the room. I sent them both off the property. That means Victor knows I know, which means he's going to move before he intended to. How long do we have? I don't know, maybe tonight, maybe less. Nora stood up. Ethan is down the hall. I know. Damien, I know. His voice came out rougher than he'd clearly intended. He stopped himself, exhaled through his nose. I'm not going to let anything happen to him. I need you to understand that. You've known he exists for less than 36 hours. That doesn't change what I said. She looked at him, standing in the doorway of a room in his house where she'd never been, where she'd never imagined being, in a version of her life that had veered so completely off any path she'd planned that she couldn't locate the original road anymore. He's going to figure out who you are, she said, if he hasn't already. Probably. He's going to have questions. I'd expect that. He's 12, Damien. He's 12 and he's never had a father, and I don't know what this does to him. I know. He said it simply, without deflection. I don't know either. I haven't been a father for 12 years without knowing I was one, and I don't know what that means or how to do this or what I'm supposed to say to him. A pause. But I'd like the chance to figure it out. Before she could answer, there was a sound from down the hall. Then Ethan's voice, careful and neutral. I can hear you through the wall. Nora closed her eyes briefly. Damien looked at the hallway. Then he looked back at her. Something in his expression asked a question she hadn't been asked in a very long time. She stepped to the side of the door. Damien walked out into the hall. Ethan was standing in the doorway of the next room in his socks, his Cold War book closed for what appeared to be the first time all day, looking at Damien with that level, unhurried attention he brought to things he was genuinely trying to understand. You were at the library, Ethan said. Yes. You said my mom was right about Bletchley. She was. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere downstairs, Marcus was on the phone. Outside, the wind had picked up in the old trees. You have the same eyes as me, Ethan said. Damien held the boy's gaze. Yes. Okay, Ethan said. He nodded once, that same nod he'd given in the school lobby, the acknowledgement of information received and filed and not yet fully processed. Then he looked past Damien at Nora in the doorway. Is someone going to tell me what's actually happening, or are we still doing the thing where you explain things gradually so I don't freak out? You don't freak out, Nora said. I know. That's why you could just tell me. She looked at her son, then at Damien. Damien looked at the floor briefly, then at Ethan. Why don't we go downstairs, he said. Marcus makes bad coffee, but it's coffee. We can sit down. Ethan considered this. I don't drink coffee. There's probably something else. Okay? He bent down and picked up his book from where he'd set it against the doorframe. A 12-year-old getting ready to hear something that would rewrite the story he'd been living in. He seemed to understand that. He picked up the book like it was an anchor and straightened up and looked at Damien. Are we in danger right now? Possibly, Damien said, not flinching from it, not softening it, but not right this second. And you're going to keep us safe. That's my intention. Ethan looked at him for one more moment, then, all right, and he walked past them both toward the stairs. Nora watched him go. She watched the back of her son's head, the way he held his shoulders. Not tensed, not afraid, just moving forward with that particular quality of deliberate calm she had watched develop in him since he was very small. She turned to find Damien watching him too. His face, for the first time since she'd seen him walk through the library doors, had come completely undone. Not dramatically, not with any of the theater that lesser men would have allowed themselves. Just a quiet, thorough dismantling of the control he'd been holding all day.
He was looking at his son's back, and his jaw was working, and his hands were very still at his sides, and the expression on his face was something she had no word for, had never had a word for, because it was the look of a man encountering something he had forfeited without knowing it was being taken. "Damien." Her voice was quiet. He turned to her. He got his face back mostly. "Yeah. He's going to be okay," she said. "He's been okay." He nodded.
He didn't look entirely convinced. "I want to be part of that, going forward." "I know." "I should have been." "Don't." She said it firmly, not unkindly. "That conversation is for another day. Right now we have a man who's already made his move and a 12-year-old downstairs waiting for information." She looked at him. "One thing at a time." He held her gaze. Then, "One thing at a time." They went downstairs. Marcus was off the phone. He was standing at the kitchen table with his laptop open, and when they came in, his expression told her the one thing at a time was already not going to be possible. "Victor's people," he said. "2 vehicles. They came off the highway 20 minutes ago. We have maybe 15 minutes before they're at the gate." Ethan stood very still at the counter with a glass of orange juice he hadn't drunk. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Damien. Then, with the particular precision of a 12-year-old who had spent the last several years reading about conflict and strategy and the places where careful planning met sudden chaos, he set down his glass and said very quietly, "What do you need me to do?" And Damien Vescari, who had not known for 36 hours that he had a son, looked at this boy, his boy, and felt something tear open in his chest that was never, for the rest of his life, going to close completely. Damien moved first. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put his hand on Ethan's shoulder, not roughly, but with the firm, redirecting pressure of someone who had made fast decisions in tight spaces for 20 years. "You go with Marcus," he said. "You stay with Marcus. You do exactly what he says." Ethan looked up at him, not afraid, not even particularly startled, processing. "How many are there?" "Doesn't matter." "It might." "Ethan." Damien held the boy's gaze. Something passed between them. Not yet the language of father and son, too new for that, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized itself. "Please." The please did it. Ethan nodded and moved. Marcus had the laptop under one arm and his phone to his ear and was already heading for the back hallway, talking quietly in a language Nora couldn't identify. Ethan fell in beside him without being told twice, still carrying his book, because of course he was. Nora turned to Damien. "What do you need?" "You, in the back room with Ethan." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. His jacket was off, and she could see the shape of what was holstered at his side, which she'd been carefully not looking at since they arrived. "I have 4 men on the perimeter. Victor's people aren't coming to talk." "I know what they're coming for." "Then you know I need you. I need you to tell me what's actually happening." She kept her voice low and even. "Victor moved up his timeline," you said. "That means he knows you found the transfers. That means he's burned his own cover intentionally, which means he's not worried about subtlety anymore, which means he thinks he has enough to end this cleanly." She watched his face. "What aren't you telling me?" Damien was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "The safe house," he said. "The location. It's in a document that 6 people have access to. Marcus and I are 2 of them. The other 4 are part of the Foundation's administrative structure, and Victor helped build that structure." He held her eyes. "He's known where I would bring you since before I decided to bring you here." The kitchen went very still. "This was the trap," Nora said. "Yes." "You walked us into it." His jaw tightened. "I thought I had more time. We need to leave. We need to leave now." He was already moving, pulling his phone out, issuing instructions in the clipped half-sentences of a man whose people had been trained to fill in the rest. He got to the back hallway in 4 strides, and Nora was right behind him, and they found Marcus and Ethan in the mudroom where Marcus had pulled a locked cabinet off the wall and was distributing items from it with efficient speed. Ethan was watching him with the look of a boy who had read about this kind of thing in enough detail to recognize it in practice. He hadn't gone pale. He hadn't started shaking. He was just watching and filing. "There's a vehicle in the barn," Marcus said without looking up. "Keys are inside. The back road goes through the property's north edge and connects to the county road about a mile out. If they came in from the highway, they don't know about the north road." "If they came in from the highway," Nora said. Marcus looked at her. Correct. She looked at Damien. Take Ethan, Damien said. Marcus goes with you. Get to the county road and keep moving. And you? I'll follow. Damien, I have 4 men and a property I know better than Victor's people do. He said it firmly, not to reassure her, but because it was simply what was going to happen. Take my son and go. Ethan, who had been very quiet during this exchange, looked at his mother. Something moved in his face, the first fracture she'd seen in his composure since the school lobby. Not fear exactly, recognition. The word son coming out of a stranger's mouth about him, in a mudroom in a farmhouse outside Portland while men with bad intentions were coming up the drive. He looked at Damien. You're going to be here when we get to the road. It wasn't entirely a question. Damien looked at him. Yes. Ethan nodded once. He followed Marcus. Nora stood in the mudroom doorway for one more second. She looked at Damien's face, the set of it, the particular quality of attention he brought to the middle distance when he was listening for something, and recognized it from a long time ago when she had loved him and believed she was going to keep loving him and had no idea what the world was about to do to that plan. Don't do anything you can't come back from, she said. His eyes moved to her. I'll try. It wasn't the answer she wanted. It was an honest one. She went. The barn was 50 yards from the house through wet grass, and the night was dark enough that the distance felt longer. Marcus moved fast without appearing to hurry, which was a skill she hadn't seen up close before. Ethan kept pace without complaint. Nora stayed a step behind both of them and kept her eyes on the tree line and tried to locate the 4 perimeter men Damien had mentioned and couldn't find any of them. The vehicle in the barn was an older model SUV, dark blue, unremarkable. Marcus had the keys and had the engine running before Nora had the back door open for Ethan. She got in the front. Ethan settled into the back seat and immediately looked out every window in a systematic arc that made her chest hurt. Seatbelt, she said, because something in her needed to say one normal thing. He put it on. Marcus drove without headlights until they cleared the barn, then kept them dim on the back road, moving at a speed that was fast enough to matter and slow enough not to announce itself. The road was rutted and the SUV moved through it unevenly, gravel pinging off the undercarriage. The man from the library, Ethan said from the back seat. Yes, Nora said. He's my father. Not a question. She turned to look at him. He was watching the window, tracking the trees moving past in the dark. His book was in his lap, and his hands were on top of it. Yes, she said. Okay. He absorbed this. And someone in his organization has been trying to keep us separate. Yes. That's why you left. She'd had 13 years to prepare for this conversation and still had nothing useful ready. I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. He was quiet for a moment. Were you wrong? I don't know yet. Another pause. Were you right? You're here, she said. You're 12 years old and you're here. So yes, for the most part. He turned from the window and looked at her in the dim light from the dash. I'm not angry, he said. The way he said it was careful and specific, like a boy who understood that what he said next would be remembered. I need you to know I'm not angry. I just want to know the full version when there's time for it. There's going to be time for it. Okay? He looked back out the window. The man who's trying to kill us, is he the same one who made you leave? Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror. Yes, Nora said. Ethan nodded slowly. Victor Salazar, he said. Nora turned fully in her seat. How do you know that name? Ethan looked at her. For a moment he looked like what he actually was, a 12-year-old in the back seat of a car in the dark, and not like the composed, self-contained person he'd been constructing himself into since he was old enough to understand that his mother carried something heavy and had reasons she hadn't shared. The library books, he said. I've been reading about criminal organization structures for a couple of months, regional crime families, transition of power, historical case studies. He paused. And I've been reading about the Viscari organization specifically. The SUV went over a rut and Marcus steadied it. No one said anything for a moment. For a couple of months, Nora said. Since February, when you started getting quiet in a new way. She looked at her son. I didn't know what I was looking for, Ethan said. I just knew something had changed and you weren't telling me what it was. And I found a news archive about the foundation, the Literacy Foundation that was being set up anonymously. There were court documents attached from an old settlement, and one of them had a name. He looked at her steadily. Vescari. And after that, I couldn't stop reading. I didn't know he was going to walk into our library. That part was a coincidence. Ethan, I know. You've been researching your own father's criminal organization. I didn't know he was my father when I started. A pause. Though I had a theory. By the end of February, I had a fairly strong theory. Marcus made a sound that was not quite a laugh and then controlled it. We're going to talk about this, Nora said. At length. I know. He shifted his book. But there's something I need to tell you. I've known about Victor Salazar for 6 weeks. He's not just a consigliere. There are 3 archived articles I found through a university database. They're behind a paywall, but I got access through the library system. That reference a financial investigation from 8 years ago. The investigation was closed and the records are sealed. But the summary that was made public references offshore accounts that were attributed at the time to a mid-level figure in the Vescari organization who was never named. He looked at her. And there's a legal correspondent note in the Portland Courier archive from 4 years ago about a sealed deposition in a federal racketeering case, and the deposition references someone the filing calls the internal facilitator, someone who had been feeding information to federal investigators while simultaneously running operations on the criminal side. The county road appeared ahead of them, a broader stretch of gray in the dark. He's been playing both sides, Nora said, for years, based on what I could find. He makes himself indispensable to the organization while building a parallel relationship with federal agencies. Which means if Damien moves against him directly, Victor can trigger a federal response that protects him and dismantles the organization simultaneously. Ethan paused. He doesn't need to win in a fight. He just needs the fight to happen. Marcus pulled onto the county road and finally turned the headlights to full. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How old are you?" 12, Ethan said. "I'll be 13 in March." Marcus said something under his breath in what was probably Portuguese. Nora's phone buzzed, Damien's number. She answered it immediately. "We're on the county road. Are you—" "I need you to listen." His voice was different than it had been in the mudroom. Tight, controlled in a way that took effort. "They had someone on the north road. 2 of my men are down. I'm at the main house. We're coming back." "No, keep moving." A sound in the background she couldn't identify. "Victor is here." "Victor is there personally." "Yes." A pause. In the background, a voice. Not close, but audible. Calm. Pleasant. "He wants to speak with me. He says he's done with the plan that involves men and guns. He says he has something else." "Don't." Her voice came out sharp. "Damien, don't talk to him alone. I'm going to see what he has." His voice had gone very quiet. "I need to know what he's holding. If it's something that touches Ethan, tell him to wait." She pressed the phone hard against her ear. In the back seat, Ethan had gone completely still. "Tell him you need 20 minutes. I need to tell you something first." "Nora, 20 minutes, please." She looked at Marcus. "Can you get us back to the house on a different route?" Marcus was already slowing the SUV. "Maybe 12 minutes if we cut through the Jensen easement." "I heard that," Damien said. "Good. Wait for us." A silence. Then, 15 minutes. After that, I'm going in regardless. She hung up and turned to Ethan. "What else do you know?" "The offshore accounts," Ethan said without hesitation, because he had clearly been waiting for this question and had organized his answer in advance. The ones from the investigation 8 years ago. They were never publicly linked to a name, but the federal case summary listed 3 financial instruments that were traced through a Cayman structure. I found a correspondent legal notice in a Panamanian registry database that references one of the same instruments and lists a beneficial owner through a numbered company. He looked at her very directly. "I wrote down the company number. It's in my book." She stared at him. "I thought it might be useful someday," Ethan said. "I didn't know it was going to be tonight." Sit. Marcus got them back in 11 minutes. The farmhouse was still standing, which was the first thing Nora assessed as they came up the access road from the east. 2 vehicles she didn't recognize were parked in front, black, large, the kind of vehicles that were chosen for their lack of distinguishing features. Three men stood outside them. They tracked the SUV as it came up the drive, but didn't move toward it. Victor Salazar was waiting for them. He was standing on the farmhouse porch with his hands in his overcoat pockets, and his expression exactly as she remembered it. Pleasant, patient, the look of a man who had already run the numbers on every outcome and found none of them particularly troubling. Damien stood 6 feet away from him in the porch light, and he had the particular stillness of a man who is holding a very large amount of very controlled anger by the thinnest available thread. Victor looked at the SUV. He looked at Nora when she got out. Then he looked at Ethan, and something moved in his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite satisfaction, but contained both. "Nora," he said. His voice was warm. "I've been hoping we could all finally have a proper conversation." She said nothing. "And this must be Ethan." He looked at the boy with the specific attention of a man assessing a variable he'd long factored out of his calculations and was now reassessing. "I've seen photographs, of course, but you're taller than I expected." Ethan looked at Victor Salazar with an expression Nora had never seen on him before. Not fear, not anger. Something cold and precise and much older than 12. "You're the man who told my mother to disappear." Victor's pleasant expression didn't change. "I gave her very practical advice at a very complicated time. She's here and healthy, which is more than could be said for some outcomes." "And my father's 2 men who are down tonight," Ethan said. "What would you call that?" A small pause. "Collateral to an unfortunate situation. They have names." Victor looked at the boy for a moment, and for the first time something flickered behind his eyes that wasn't entirely calculated. He looked at Nora. "He's extraordinary," he said. "Really. He must get it from you." "What do you want?" Damien said. His voice was absolutely flat. The voice of a man who had decided that conversation would be brief. Victor reached into his overcoat and produced a tablet. He held it up so Damien could see the screen without approaching him. Nora couldn't see it from where she stood. Whatever was on it, she watched Damien's face when he saw it. His expression didn't fall apart. It went the other direction. It locked down, completely, the way a building goes into lockdown, every door shutting in sequence. His jaw set. A muscle at his temple moved once and stopped. His eyes stayed on the screen for 3 seconds. "Where did you get that?" Damien said. "From the deposition you gave 8 years ago in the Carranza matter." Victor lowered the tablet. "A sealed deposition, yes, which the federal prosecutor agreed to revisit when I provided certain additional context 6 months ago." He tilted his head. "You were very forthcoming, Damien, in that room." "I understand why. The details you shared about the Carranza operation helped close a significant case. I understand the arrangement you made." The porch was very quiet. Nora looked at Damien. He was not looking at her. I was looking at Victor with the fixed, empty attention of a man who had just watched the ground shift beneath him and was cataloging the damage. "You made a deal," Nora said. Damien's eyes moved to her. Something in them she hadn't seen before. Not shame exactly, but its shadow. Something that had been carried a long time. 8 years ago, she said. "You gave testimony." "It was contained," he said. His voice was tight. "It was limited to Carranza. It didn't touch my organization." "It touched 3 people in your organization," Victor said pleasantly. "You were careful not to name anyone above a certain level, but below that level," he shrugged. "It was enough for the prosecutors. They were satisfied." He looked at Nora. "What Damien has never told anyone, but what I discovered by accident 3 years ago through a source in the federal building, is that the arrangement wasn't fully closed. There's a contingency in it, an ongoing cooperation clause." He looked back at Damien. "Which means the man who leads the Viscari organization has been, technically, an active federal cooperator for 8 years. Damien's jaw was rigid. "If that becomes known," Victor continued, "inside our network, to the family heads, to the men currently on this property, Damien doesn't have an organization to lead anymore. He has a target." He put the tablet back in his coat. "Which is why I've come personally, tonight, rather than letting the messier version of this play out. I'm offering a clean solution." "You want the organization," Damien said. "I want what I've been building toward for 18 years, the transfer of authority, your signature on 3 documents. And then you take your family," a brief look at Ethan, "and you go somewhere quiet, and this ends without anyone else getting hurt." The word family, the way he used it, deliberate and precise, directed at the boy on the gravel drive, landed the way it was intended to land. Ethan stepped forward. Nora's hand moved toward him instinctively. "Mr. Salazar," Ethan said. His voice was very level. "The offshore accounts from the Cayman structure. The beneficial ownership listed under company number 441 Bravo 77 in the Panamanian registry." Victor went still. It was the first time Nora had seen him go still. The pleasantness didn't leave his face immediately. It drained slowly, the way water drains, leaving the surface exactly as it was, but emptied of everything that had made it look like something. "Where did you hear that number?" Victor said. "The Courier Archive. The federal correspondent notes from the racketeering case 4 years ago. It's not in the sealed portion. It's in the public summary, in a footnote that references the instrument by number without attribution." Ethan held the older man's gaze without any visible effort. "You've been feeding information to federal agencies. That's your protection, your insurance against Damien's cooperation clause. You have your own. But the offshore accounts are the other side of it. You've been taking payments from both the organization and the agencies you're cooperating with, which means you're not a protected witness. You're a criminal who's been committing fraud against both parties simultaneously." Victor said nothing. "If the federal prosecutor who holds Damien's cooperation clause receives that company number and the Panama registry reference," Ethan continued, "they have enough to reopen the financial investigation, and this time the attribution won't be sealed." He stopped. "I sent an encrypted message from the library computers 3 days ago." The porch light was very bright and very still. "I didn't know who I was sending it to," Ethan said. "I didn't have a name to put to any of it yet. But I had the number and the registry reference, and I sent it to the Federal Public Corruption Tip Line with a note saying it was related to the Vescari racketeering case." He looked at Victor with the clear, unimpressed eyes of someone who had done the reading and followed the logic to its end. "I imagine they're looking at it." Victor Salazar looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he looked at Damien. Then he looked at Nora. "He's 12, Victor said. It came out differently than anything he'd said before, not pleasant, not controlled, genuinely unsteady. "He'll be 13 in March," Nora said. What happened next was fast. Victor's hand moved toward his coat. One of his men outside the vehicles moved simultaneously. And Damien, who had been standing 6 feet away holding the thinnest available thread for the last 20 minutes, closed that distance in 2 steps and caught Victor's wrist before he cleared the coat, and the tablet clattered off the porch rail, and Victor made a sound that was not the sound of a man in control of anything. Marcus had his weapon up. Victor's men outside held. They held because Marcus had made a very specific calculation about angles, and because Victor's men were professional enough to understand it. Damien had Victor's arm behind his back and Victor's face against the porch pillar, and his mouth was very close to the older man's ear, and whatever he said was too quiet for anyone else to hear. Victor's body went very still. In the ringing quiet, Damien stepped back. He released Victor's arm. He straightened his shirt. Victor turned slowly. His face was reconfigured now, the pleasantness completely gone, leaving something underneath it that was older and harder and not very interesting to look at. He looked at Damien. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the way Damien was standing between them. "This isn't finished," Victor said. "Yes," Damien said. "It is." But Nora watched Victor's eyes move very briefly to Ethan one more time, calculating, reassessing, the look of a man rerunning numbers. And she understood in that moment with complete clarity that surrendering power was not the same as losing, and that a man who had spent 18 years building leverage from both directions would not stop building it because of one bad night. One of Victor's men said something from near the vehicles. Victor straightened his coat. He walked down the porch steps with something close to his usual composure. He got into the first vehicle without looking back. The vehicles left. The gravel settled. Marcus lowered his weapon. Ethan stood in the driveway with his Cold War book held against his chest and watched the taillights disappear down the drive. And then he turned and looked at Damien on the porch. And Damien looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Damien came down the steps and crouched down in front of his son. Actually crouched, so they were at eye level, in the wet gravel in the dark. And he put both hands on Ethan's shoulders and looked at him very directly. "Are you hurt?" Damien said. "No." "Are you scared?" A pause. "A little. Now that it's over, I wasn't juring. That's normal. That's how it's supposed to work. Ethan looked at him. Is it over? Damien held his son's gaze, and Nora watched his face in the porch light, and she watched him make the decision she'd seen him make before, a long time ago, in a different life. The decision to tell the truth when a lie would have been easier and kinder and entirely forgivable. No, Damien said. Not yet. Ethan absorbed this. He nodded once. But I'm going to need your help, Damien said. The message you sent, the company number. I need to know exactly what you sent and where you sent it, because that message is the only thing we have that he can't predict. Ethan straightened. Something settled in him. Not relief, but purpose. I wrote it down, he said. In the book. He held it out. Damien took it carefully, the way you take something that matters, and stood up. Nora looked at the two of them standing there in the gravel in the dark, her son, and the man she'd spent 13 years protecting him from the consequences of loving, and she felt the walls she'd built doing what walls eventually do. Not falling, choosing, finally, to open. And somewhere down the county road, in the back of a black vehicle that smelled of leather and expensive cologne, Victor Salazar was already on the phone, and the voice on the other end was asking what had happened, and Victor's answer was very quiet and very calm and contained. In it, the particular patience of a man who had learned long ago that the best traps were the ones that looked, from the outside, exactly like an escape. They worked through the night. Damien spread the contents of Ethan's book across the kitchen table. The folded papers the boy had tucked inside the back cover, covered in the small, precise handwriting of someone who had learned early that details mattered and space was finite. Company numbers, registry references, dates, case file notations copied from library archives, a hand-drawn diagram of what Ethan had concluded was the offshore structure's three-tier arrangement. Marcus stood across the table and went through it piece by piece with the expression of a man revising his understanding of several things simultaneously. The tip-line submission, Marcus said. When exactly? Tuesday, Ethan said. He was sitting at the end of the table with his hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate that Damien had made without asking and set in front of him without comment. 3 days ago. I used the library's public terminal. I created a temporary encrypted email through a service that doesn't log IPs, sent the submission, then deleted the account. Marcus looked at Damien. He used a library terminal, Damien said. I heard. He's 12. I'm aware. Ethan looked between them. The encrypted service is publicly available. There's a tutorial in a cybersecurity book in the library's reference section. It's not complicated. Nora was sitting against the far counter with her arms crossed, and her eyes on her son with an expression that contained several years' worth of future conversations. She said nothing. The question, Damien said, pulling his attention back to the papers, is whether the submission has been actioned. If it's been sitting in a queue, we have time. If someone pulled it and ran the company number, he stopped. Then there's already an inquiry open, Marcus said, which means Victor knows. He has a contact in the federal building. We established that. If he knows the tip exists, he knows Ethan sent it. He can't prove it, but he knows. Damien looked at the papers. He can't let an inquiry proceed. If the accounts are opened up, his cooperation arrangement unravels. He loses his protection on both sides simultaneously. He put his palms flat on the table. He's going to move tonight. He's been moving all night, Nora said. He's going to move differently. Damien straightened. He doesn't want the organization anymore. He wants it dismantled on his terms so there's nothing left to investigate. He burns the structure, he burns his own connection to it, and he walks away clean. He looked at Marcus, the waterfront property. Marcus was quiet for a second. The Hargrove shipyard. He's used it before, for things that needed to disappear. It's been decommissioned for 4 years. He has the secondary lease through the import company. He's going to want a contained location, somewhere the fire investigator writes up as an industrial accident. Damien's voice was completely even. He's going to want us there. Then we don't go, Nora said. Damien looked at her. We don't go, she said again. We take what Ethan found and we take it directly to the federal office, tonight, in person, and we let the inquiry do what it does. The federal office opens at 8 in the morning. Then we wait until 8. Victor's people will find us before 8. He said it without apology because it wasn't an apology, it was a fact. He knows this property. He pulled back tonight because Ethan's tip changed his calculation, not because he's finished. He's regrouping. He will come back here, or he'll find where we go if we run. He held her eyes. The only move that ends this is one he doesn't expect. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. You want to go to the shipyard, she said. I want to get there before he does. That's insane. Probably. Damien, he's going to bring Ethan into it. He said it quietly and completely. Not tonight, maybe. Maybe not next week. But Victor Salazar has spent 18 years building leverage, and right now the most powerful piece of leverage he has against me isn't the cooperation clause or the offshore accounts. It's the fact that I have something to lose that I didn't have 4 days ago. He looked at Ethan, briefly, controlled, the look of a man being careful about what he lets show. I'm not going to let that stand. Ethan was looking at him steadily over the rim of his mug. I go, Damien said. Marcus and 2 men. We get to the shipyard and we control the ground before he does. He looked at Nora. You take Ethan. There's a location Marcus will give you. Off-network, clean, nobody connects it to me or the Foundation. You stay there until I call you. And if you don't call, I'll call. That's not Nora. He said it the way he'd said it in the restaurant 2 nights ago. Without performance, without the architecture of a man managing a situation. Just her name, direct and tired and real. I know what I'm asking you to trust. I know I haven't earned it back yet. But I need you to do this anyway. The refrigerator hummed. The wind moved in the old trees outside. Ethan set his mug down very carefully. I want to come, Ethan said. No, said Damien and Nora simultaneously. Ethan looked at his father. The information I found, you might need me to explain it. The structure is complicated, and if you're trying to use it in a confrontation, I understand the structure, Damien said. You've had it for 40 minutes. Ethan. Damien crouched down again, the same way he had in the driveway, putting them at eye level. His voice dropped. I need you to be somewhere safe. That is not a negotiable thing. I need that so I can do what I need to do without spending half my attention making sure you're okay. He held the boy's gaze. Do you understand what I'm saying? A pause. Ethan's jaw moved slightly. You're saying I'm your weak point. I'm saying you're what matters. Those are different. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his book and pulled out one more folded paper and handed it to Damien. The 3rd tier of the offshore structure routes through a correspondent bank in the Netherlands. The routing code is on there. If you need to prove the accounts are live and funded, that code pulls it up in the federal database. He held Damien's gaze. Don't lose it. Damien took the paper. He straightened up. Something moved in his face that he didn't try to control. I won't. Marcus drove Nora and Ethan to a single-story house in Beaverton that smelled of fresh paint and had no photographs on the walls, and a refrigerator stocked with things someone had purchased with the specific practicality of emergency preparation. A woman named Dell was already there, 50s, gray-haired, with the clipped efficiency of someone who had been trusted with difficult things before and hadn't broken anything. She showed them the rooms and the exits and where the landline was, and then left them alone. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed in the smaller room and looked at his hands. Nora stood in the doorway. Talk to me. I'm thinking. About what? He looked up. Whether I made it worse. The tip I sent. If I hadn't sent it, Victor's play tonight would have been different. He would have tried to force the transfer of the organization, and Damien would have... I don't know what Damien would have done. He paused. But it would have been a different problem. A more predictable one. You couldn't have known he was coming to the library? No, but I sent it 3 days ago. He looked at his hands again. I found that stuff 2 months ago. I could have sent it 2 months ago. I sat on it because I didn't know if I should trust it, and when I finally sent it, the timing made everything... He stopped. Ethan. She came into the room and sat beside him on the bed. Look at me. He did. You're 12 years old and you found a financial instrument buried in a sealed court summary and connected it to an offshore structure and sent an encrypted anonymous tip to the right government agency. The fact that the timing was complicated is not something you are responsible for. He was quiet for a moment. I just want him to be okay. She looked at her son, the particular pain of hearing him say that. Simply, without drama, just a boy who had found out he had a father approximately 18 hours ago and was already afraid of losing him. Me too, she said. She put her arm around him and he let her, which he didn't always anymore. And they sat there in the clean-smelling safe house room while the night outside moved toward morning. The Hargrove shipyard was a long dead thing. It had closed in the early 2000s and spent the years since acquiring the particular character of industrial abandonment, rust and weather, damage and the smell of salt water and old machinery, and the specific silence of a place where many people used to be and no longer were. The loading docks ran along the river for 300 yards. The main warehouse structure was still standing, its roof intact in most places. Its interior a maze of old equipment and support columns, and the rusted skeletons of cranes that hadn't moved in 15 years. Damien had been here twice before. Both times, the problem he'd brought here had stayed here. He went in from the south access with Marcus and two men, Reyes and Garrett, both long-term, both people whose loyalty he had tested under conditions that didn't allow for ambiguity. They moved through the south dock without lights, using the ambient glow of the river and the far lights of the industrial park across the water. Damien had the layout in his head. He'd made sure of that on the drive over. They found Victor's people at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning, not where he'd expected them. That was the first problem. Victor had come in from the north dock, the riverside, which meant he'd come by water, which meant he'd planned this before tonight, before the farmhouse confrontation, before Ethan's announcement about the tip. He'd planned it before any of that because Victor Salazar planned things in concentric circles, each one a fallback for the one inside it, and the shipyard had always been the outermost ring. Damien heard them before he saw them. Voices, low, more than he'd anticipated. Not the 4 or 5 men a contained operation required, but the sound of a coordinated group spreading across a space. He pressed back against a support column and held up 3 fingers to Marcus. Wait. Marcus counted with him. 8, maybe 10. Victor had brought a small army, which meant he wasn't just planning to resolve a personal conflict. He was planning to leave nothing that needed explaining afterward. Damien's phone vibrated. A text from a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it. North Crane Platform. Come alone. Or the boy's tip gets buried and your cooperation file goes to every family head by morning. V. He showed it to Marcus. Marcus's expression was very still. He has someone at the federal office. He has someone everywhere. Damien pocketed the phone. Stay with Reyes. Garrett, south exit. Keep it clear. He looked at Marcus. 15 minutes. If I'm not out, I know what to do. Don't come in after me. That's not what I said I'd do. Marcus. I said I know what to do. Marcus held his gaze. Go. The North Crane platform was 50 feet up, accessed by a rusted steel staircase along the warehouse's interior north wall. Damien took the stairs without hurrying, keeping his footfalls even, one hand on the rail and one hand free. The metal vibrated under his weight. Below him, the warehouse floor was dark and cross-hatched with pale strips of light from the river-facing windows. Victor was at the top. He was standing near the crane operator's old station, which was an enclosed booth with a cracked glass window and a rusted control panel. He had one man with him, back against the wall, weapon visible. The platform was maybe 20 feet square, with a railing on 3 sides and a 60-foot drop to the concrete below on the 4th. Victor was alone otherwise, which was the first thing that told Damien something was wrong. A man who'd brought 10 people to a location didn't stand on a platform with one guard. He stood somewhere his 10 people could reach him, unless the 10 people weren't here for Victor. Damien cleared the top of the stairs and stopped. You came, Victor said. He sounded genuinely satisfied. I wondered if you would. You knew I would. Yes. But there's a difference between knowing someone will do something and seeing them do it. He tilted his head. Where's the boy? Somewhere you won't find him. I'm not looking for him tonight. Victor's hands were in his coat pockets again. The man against the wall hadn't moved. Tonight is about resolution. I told you that at the farmhouse. You told me to sign papers, and you declined, so we're here instead. He took his right hand out of his pocket. He was holding a phone, screen out, displaying a document. Even from 10 feet away, Damien could see enough of it. The header, the federal seal, his own name. Your cooperation file, the complete version, not the sanitized one. Names, dates, the Carranza specifics, all of it. He turned the screen off. I have a distribution list assembled. 43 recipients, family heads, senior organization members, several foreign partners. He paused. 1 press contact. Then send it, Damien said. Victor's head tilted fractionally. I'm sorry? Send it. Damien came fully onto the platform. If you were going to send it, you'd have sent it before I climbed 50 feet of stairs. You brought me up here because you need something I haven't given you yet. Victor looked at him. The pleasantness had not returned after the farmhouse. What was there instead was less rehearsed, older, the face of a man who had been managing his own performance for so long he'd forgotten it was a performance. The routing code, Victor said. Damien said nothing. The boy gave you something when he handed you the book, something he'd written separately, at the end. Victor's voice was very flat now. I need that code, because if that code reaches the federal database before I can close those accounts, the inquiry becomes a seizure, and a seizure becomes a conviction. A pause. My conviction. Yes, Damien said. It does. Give me the code and this ends. The file goes in the river. I disappear. You keep whatever remains of the organization, you raise your son, everyone proceeds. His voice had the practiced cadence of a man who had sat across from many people in many difficult rooms and always found the number they would accept. It's a reasonable trade. The last reasonable trade you offered cost me 13 years. That was different, was it? Victor's eyes narrowed very slightly. You were going to get her killed. You were going to get the child killed. You were building an empire with one hand and starting a family with the other, and you didn't have the political capital yet to protect both. What I did was, what you did, Damien said, his voice dropping to something very quiet, was decide what I was worth, what my son was worth. You ran the numbers and you decided for both of us. He took 2 steps forward. The guard against the wall shifted. Damien didn't look at him. Don't tell me it was reasonable. It was strategic. It was yours, not mine. You made a choice that wasn't yours to make, and you've been holding it over this organization ever since because you knew that when I finally found out, this is where we'd end up. He stopped 6 feet from Victor. You've been planning this conversation for 18 years. Something moved in Victor's face. Not guilt. Victor Salazar did not appear to be structurally capable of guilt, but something that was its functional equivalent. The acknowledgement of something that had weight. Give me the code, Victor said. No. Victor's hand went to his phone. The shot came from below. Not from Victor's man. From the warehouse floor. A single controlled shot that came through the cracked glass of the crane booth and took Victor's phone out of his hand with the kind of precision that came from a very long time of practice and a very specific angle. Victor's man raised his weapon. Damien was already moving. He covered the 6 feet in 2 strides and hit Victor's man at the shoulder level, driving him sideways into the railing. The weapon discharged into the ceiling. The railing held, but it bent. A groaning sound of old metal taking impact, and Victor's man went down on one knee, and Damien's elbow came down across the back of his neck, and the man stayed down. Victor had moved for the stairs. Damien caught him by the coat collar 3 feet from the stairhead and pulled him back, and Victor was 60 years old and not a physical man. And what happened next was not a fight. It was a closing of distance and a reversal of control that lasted approximately 4 seconds and ended with Victor's back against the crane booth wall and Damien's forearm across his chest, and both of them breathing hard in the dark of the platform. Below, voices, running, Victor's 10 men responding to the shot. And then, over the warehouse speakers, old, crackling, but functional, because Marcus had found the panel 17 minutes ago and had been waiting for the signal. A voice, clear and amplified and official and very, very loud. Federal agents, all persons in the Hargrove facility. This is a federal law enforcement action. Do not move. Do not move. The sound of Victor's men below changed character immediately. Running became stopping, became the specific chaos of people who have just discovered that the shape of the problem there inside is entirely different from what they were told. Victor's eyes went wide. The routing code, Damien said, very close and very quiet. Ethan sent it, not to the tip line this time. He sent it directly to the agent who originally handled the Carranza case. 2 hours ago, from Dell's landline, after I called him. He held Victor's gaze. Dell used to work federal prosecution. Did you know that? Marcus found her. A pause. She knew the right number. Below them, the sounds of the warehouse were reorganizing into the specific sounds of an operation that had prepared for resistance and encountered very little of it. Victor's mouth moved. No sound came out for a moment. The boy called it in himself, Damien said. Explained the routing code to an agent in terms the agent could immediately verify. 13-year-old in March. He stepped back. He released Victor's coat. He's going to be something. Victor straightened slowly. He looked at Damien with something that had moved completely beyond strategy, past pleasantness, past calculation, past the 18 years of management and leverage and carefully held cards. He just looked old, tired in the way people look when the thing they've been running on finally runs out. What happens now? Victor said. Now you go downstairs. Damien stepped to the side of the stairhead. And you answer questions from people with federal authority to ask them, which is more than you ever gave anyone else. I could tell them about my file is already part of the inquiry. I submitted it this morning. He held Victor's eyes. Full version, annotated, with a request for formal review of the cooperation arrangement. My attorney has been awake since 4 a.m. He paused. I'm not holding anything back anymore. Whatever consequence comes from it, I'll take. Victor stared at him. It was always going to end here, Damien said. You knew that. That's why you've been planning it for 18 years. He looked at the older man steadily. You just planned it wrong. Footsteps on the stairs. Federal agents, moving fast, the sounds of equipment and authority coming up through the metal. Victor heard them. He looked at the stairhead. He looked at Damien one final time, and whatever was in that look was too complicated and too finished to name. And then he walked to the stairs and went down toward the people waiting for him. Damien stood on the platform alone for a moment. Below, through the crane booth's cracked window, he could see the warehouse floor filling with light, flashlights, tactical lights, the organized illumination of a space being secured. He could hear voices giving instructions and other voices complying. He could hear the particular sound of an operation concluding, not the violent conclusion he'd spent 20 years building his reputation on, but something different, something that involved paperwork and procedures and the slow, grinding machinery of accountability. His phone buzzed. Nora's number. He answered before the second vibration. I'm okay. A silence on her end. Then very quietly, Ethan wants to know if the routing code worked. Damien looked down through the window at the men on the warehouse floor. At Victor Salazar, being guided toward the south exit, with his hands behind his back and his coat still perfectly on. At Marcus standing near the east wall, watching the operation with his arms crossed, and his face expressing nothing, which was how Marcus expressed everything. Tell him yes, Damien said. Tell him it worked. Another silence. Then Ethan's voice, close to the phone. Did you lose the paper? Despite everything, despite the man with the weapon on the floor of the platform, despite the platform railing that was now permanently bent, despite the 48 hours of accumulated fear and exhaustion that were sitting on his chest like something physical, Damien felt something give way in him that wasn't collapse but was its neighbor. No, he said. I didn't lose the paper. Good. A pause. Are you coming back? The lights below were spreading through the warehouse, filling all the dark corners, reaching the walls. The place was too big to light entirely, but they were managing most of it. Someone down there would have a camera, someone would have a recorder. The building that had spent 15 years holding the things that needed to disappear was going to spend tonight in a very different kind of documentation. Yes, Damien said, I'm coming back. He stood there one moment longer, breathing the shipyard air, rust and salt water and something that might have been the end of a very long chapter, and then he walked to the stairs and began the descent, his hand on the railing, his footsteps steady, moving down toward the light and the voices and everything that came next. The federal processing took 11 hours. Damien sat in a conference room at the Portland field office from 4 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, and in that time he drank 6 cups of bad coffee and answered every question he was asked without consulting the attorney who was sitting beside him, because he had decided on the platform at the Hargrove shipyard that he was done deciding what to hold back. The attorney, a woman named Sierra Voss who had represented him for 6 years and had never once seen him volunteer information, spent the first 2 hours with a very specific expression on her face and then appeared to make a private adjustment to her understanding of the situation and began taking notes instead. The agent across the table was a man named Prewitt, mid-40s, with the patient and slightly worn quality of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had learned not to expect it to be simple. He had the Carranza file in front of him and the new inquiry documents beside it, and he went through everything with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the architecture of the thing mattered as much as the individual pieces. The cooperation clause, Prewitt said, somewhere around hour 4. You're aware that voluntary disclosure of its existence doesn't automatically constitute a violation. I'm aware. You're also aware that what you've submitted this morning is significantly more comprehensive than what was originally provided under the arrangement. Yes. That's going to require a formal review of the arrangement's terms, which means you may be looking at renegotiation of your status. I understand that. Prewitt looked at him, not with hostility, with the specific attention of someone trying to locate the angle and not finding it where they expected. Mr. Vescari, in my experience, people in your position don't walk in voluntarily and expand their disclosure. They do the opposite. Damien put his coffee cup down. I have a son, he said. I found out 4 days ago. He's 12 and he found a piece of evidence buried in a public court record that your office apparently missed, and he sent it to a tip line from a library computer because he was trying to protect his family. He looked at Prewitt steadily. I'm not going to teach him that the right thing to do is hold back. Prewitt was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something down. Tell me about the offshore structure, he said. So Damien told him about the offshore structure and about Victor Salazar and about 18 years of a man building leverage from both directions with the patient efficiency of someone who believed that all power was ultimately about who held the most cards when the table finally turned over. He told it in order, as completely as he could reconstruct it, and Sierra Voss wrote everything down and twice said, "My client would like to note," and once said nothing for a long time because there wasn't anything to say. At 3 in the afternoon, Prewitt closed the file. We're going to need you available, he said. The inquiry is going to take time. Salazar's attorney is already building a cooperation offer of his own. He'll offer everything he knows about the organization in exchange for a reduction. That's likely. Let him. Damien stood. His back ached from the chair. His eyes felt scraped. What he knows about my organization is already in that file, and what he knows about his own accounts is going to matter a lot more. Prewitt stood as well. He looked at Damien across the conference table with the expression of a man making a final assessment. The dissolution documents your attorney submitted this morning, the asset surrender, that's going to be a complicated process. I know. Years, potentially. I know. And in the interim, your legal status with the remaining organizational entities. Agent Prewitt, Damien picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. I've been doing complicated things for 20 years. I can manage complicated. He looked at the man. Is there anything else you need from me today? A pause. No. Then I'd like to go see my son. Nora had taken Ethan to breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, and was sitting with him in the Beaverton safe house living room at 3:15 when her phone rang and she saw Damien's name and answered it before she'd finished the thought of answering it. It's done, he said. For today. She exhaled. It came out shakier than she'd have liked. Across from her, Ethan looked up from his book. A new one, Dell had a shelf, and read her face with the accuracy he always brought to reading her face. Where are you? She said. Outside the federal building. My car. A pause. How's Ethan? Ask him yourself. She held the phone out. Ethan took it. He held it to his ear and was quiet for a moment, listening. Then, yes. Another pause. I know. A shorter pause. Okay. He handed the phone back. What did he say? Nora asked. He said he didn't lose the paper. Ethan went back to his book. And that he was coming. Basam. Damien arrived at 40 minutes past 3. He looked like a man who had been awake for 36 hours and had spent 11 of them in a federal conference room, which was exactly what he was. He came through the door, and Dell handed him coffee without being asked, and he drank half of it standing in the entryway before he said anything to anyone. Ethan was in the living room. He'd put the book down. Damien came in and sat in the chair across from him, and they looked at each other for a moment. The man and the boy, in the clean-smelling room in the Beaverton safe house, with the afternoon light coming through the window and everything between them still new enough to be careful with. "Are you okay?" Ethan said. "I'm tired," Damien said. "But yes." "Victor Salazar. In custody. His attorney is already negotiating." Damien put the coffee down. "He's going to try to use what he knows about the organization to reduce his exposure. That means a long legal process." Ethan absorbed this. "But he can't." He stopped. "Reorganized. The offshore accounts. If those are seized as part of the inquiry, his negotiating position is weaker. Significantly. And the routing code I gave the agent has already been verified." Damien looked at his son. "You gave them exactly what they needed. The accounts are frozen pending the inquiry. His protection arrangement with the federal office is under review. He has very little left to trade with." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at his hands. "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." "I sent that tip 3 days ago, before I knew who you were. I did it because—" He stopped, started again. "I'd been reading about the organization for 2 months. I didn't know what I was going to do with what I found. But when I found the company number and understood what it meant, I couldn't not do anything." He looked up. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Damien said. "I didn't know it would end up like this. I didn't know you were going to walk into the library." "I know. I just thought someone should know." He paused. "Even if I couldn't explain to anyone why I cared." Damien looked at him. Something in him was very still, very open, the way things are when they've stopped being defended. "You cared because you have good instincts," he said, "and because you paid attention when other people weren't paying enough." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "That's not nothing. That's actually—" He stopped. His voice had caught slightly, which he hadn't expected or planned for, and he waited a beat. "That's the thing I'm most proud of, and I've known you for 4 days." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was moving in the room, tracking slowly across the floor the way it did at this time of year. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said. "Yes." "Are you going to be around?" The question was simple and direct and had no performance in it whatsoever. It was just a 12-year-old boy asking the thing he most needed to know, the thing he'd been not asking since the library. "Yes," Damien said, without qualification, without the conditional architecture that most answers of this kind arrived in. "I'm going to be around." Ethan nodded once. He picked up his book. He opened it to his page. Then, without looking up, "Okay." The consequences arrived in stages, the way they always do. The federal inquiry into Victor Salazar's dual cooperation arrangement opened formally in November and consumed 14 months of deposition, document review, and the kind of methodical institutional attention that the offshore accounts had never been designed to withstand. 3 of the accounts were seized within the first 30 days. The 4th took longer because of the Netherlands routing, but the code Ethan had provided made it traceable, and by February it was frozen along with the rest. Victor's attorney entered a cooperation offer in December. The prosecutor's office accepted a modified version in March, which meant Victor would spend 11 years in federal custody in exchange for testimony that closed 6 unrelated cases. The press covered it for 2 days and then moved on, which was what the press did. Damien's formal status review took 8 months. Sierra Voss managed it with the specific skill of someone who understood that the outcome depended less on the facts than on the way the facts were ordered and presented, and she was very good at ordering and presenting things. The cooperation clause was renegotiated. The asset surrender, 3 decades of accumulated criminal holdings, real estate, financial instruments, and organizational interests, was documented over the course of a year and transferred to a federal victim compensation structure that Sierra described as the most complicated single transaction of her professional career. He kept the farmhouse. It was the only property that was provably clean, purchased through a legitimate trust in his mother's name before any of the rest of it. The federal office reviewed it and agreed. He kept the farmhouse and a modest personal account, and the 41-year-old body that had been through more than it had been designed for and was making that known with increasing regularity. The criminal organization dissolved the way large things dissolve, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece requiring its own documentation and its own negotiation with the people inside it who had believed in its permanence. Some of those people were angry, some were afraid. Most were practical. Marcus handled the practical ones, and Damien handled the rest. And by the end of the first year, the structure that had taken 3 decades to build had been reduced to paperwork and memory. Marcus got out. He went back to Porto, which was where he was from, which Damien had known for 11 years and had never fully processed. They spoke by phone once a month. It was enough. Nora went back to the library in January. Not as a volunteer. Margaret had retired in December, and the board had offered Nora the director position, which came with an actual salary and the authority to make the changes she'd been suggesting for 3 years from the outside. She took it. She took it, and she reorganized the children's program and expanded the literacy partnership and hired 2 new staff members and spent the first week in the director's office rearranging the furniture so the desk faced the window instead of the wall. She established the foundation formally in the spring, not anonymously this time, not under a structure designed to keep names off things. The Ellison Vescari Children's Education Foundation filed its nonprofit paperwork in April, with both names on it, and the board meeting where they approved the first year's programming budget was the least dramatic meeting Nora had attended in approximately 14 months, which she appreciated deeply. Ethan turned 13 in March. Damien arrived at the house at 7 in the morning with breakfast from the place on Burnside that Ethan had mentioned once, 2 months before, in passing. He'd remembered. He brought it in paper bags that he'd carried from the car in the rain and set on the kitchen table with the self-conscious deliberateness of a man who was still learning the texture of ordinary occasions. Ethan looked at the bags. He looked at Damien. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. It's a Tuesday." "I know it's Tuesday. We have cereal." "You're 13, Damien said. "You can have something other than cereal." Ethan considered this. Then he sat down at the table and opened one of the bags and looked inside with the expression of someone conducting an inventory. "You got the right thing," he said. "I asked the woman at the counter." "You described it to a stranger." "I described it to a stranger, yes." Damien sat across from him. "Is that a problem?" "No." Ethan pulled out a container and opened it. "It's just—" He stopped. A small, quiet thing happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but moving in that direction. "It's fine." They ate breakfast on a Tuesday in March, in Nora's kitchen with the window that still had the latch she'd never fixed, and outside the rain came and went the way it did in Portland, and Ethan ate his birthday breakfast and read 2 pages of his current book between bites. Naval Intelligence, Pacific Theater, a period he'd covered before but was returning to from a different angle. And Damien drank his coffee and didn't say anything about the reading because he'd learned over the last few months that the reading was not something Ethan did instead of engaging. It was how Ethan engaged. It was the mode in which he processed the world and the people in it and what they meant to him. Nora came downstairs at 7:30, which was later than she usually came down, which meant she had allowed herself to sleep slightly past her alarm for the first time in a while, which was its own small information about the state of things. She looked at the bags on the table. She looked at Damien. She looked at Ethan, who was eating and reading and occupying the kitchen with the specific quality of a boy who had decided the current situation was acceptable and was proceeding accordingly. "You went to Burnside," she said. "It was raining," Damien said. "I still went." She got coffee from the pot he'd already made and sat down at the end of the table between them. Outside, the rain picked up briefly against the window and then backed off. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and whatever was in the paper bags and the particular smell of a morning that didn't require anything of anyone yet. "Ethan," Nora said, "what do you want to do today?" He turned a page. "Library." "It's your birthday." "I know, I want to go to the library." He looked up. "There's a new collection in the reference section. Primary documents from Cold War defection cases. They just arrived and I put a hold on one of the folders before anyone else could." He looked at Damien. "You could come." Damien held his son's gaze. "Yes," he said. "I can come." The library on a Tuesday afternoon in March was the same as it had always been, warm, quiet, smelling of old paper, and the particular piece of a place where nothing was required of anyone. The Tuesday children's program had ended an hour earlier, and the last of the small patrons had been collected by parents, and the building had settled into its natural state, which was a kind of chosen quiet, a quiet that existed because people had decided to come here and be still for a while. The reference section was in the back, past the biography shelves and the periodicals room. Ethan went directly to it without stopping, which was how he went everywhere. Damien followed at the pace of a man who was allowing himself to be led and was finding that he didn't mind. The folder Ethan had on hold was at the reference desk. He signed for it and took it to the table in the corner. The same table Nora noticed that he always chose, the one with the best light from the window and the most distance from foot traffic, and spread it open and began to read with the full-body attentiveness he brought to things that interested him. Damien sat across from him. Nora sat at the end of the table and watched them. The father and the son, in the library, on a Tuesday. Damien had his phone face down on the table, which was something she'd noticed he did now. He used to check it constantly, the reflexive check of a man whose world required constant monitoring. But the world he lived in now was different, and the checking had slowed and then largely stopped. He sat with his hands on the table and watched Ethan read, and his expression was something she had stopped trying to name because it was too specific to him, too particular to this version of him that was still assembling itself, and it deserved to be left unnamed for a while. Ethan looked up after a few minutes. Listen to this. He read something quietly from the folder, a paragraph from a declassified debrief, a defector's account of the moment. He understood he was being watched by his own side. He read it with the precise, unembellished delivery of someone who thought the words were interesting enough to stand without performance. When he finished, Damien was quiet for a moment. "Read the next paragraph," he said. Ethan read the next paragraph. They went on like that for a while, the boy reading and the man listening, and Nora sat at the end of the table with her hands folded and let herself be somewhere she had not been able to let herself be for a very long time, which was simply present, simply here, not calculating and not planning and not listening for the sound of something coming. The afternoon moved through the library windows in long, pale strips, tracking slowly across the floor the way it did at this time of year in this city. The heating system clicked on somewhere overhead. A few patrons moved through the shelves in the background, and the library did what libraries do, which is hold things carefully, all the things that have been put inside it, and give them back when they're asked for. At 4:30, Ethan reached the end of the folder. He sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the particular look of someone who has reached the end of something and needs a minute with it. Then he straightened up and closed the folder carefully, the way he handled things that belonged to the library, and pushed it to the center of the table. "Good?" Nora said. "Yeah." He looked at the folder. "There's a second one in the collection. I'll need to come back." "We'll come back," Damien said. Ethan looked at him. The same clear, direct, unimpressed look he'd had since the library 3 months ago, since he'd turned from the history section and found a stranger staring at him in a way that turned out to matter more than most things. He looked at Damien and held the look for a moment. "Next Tuesday?" he said. "Next Tuesday," Damien said. Ethan nodded. He gathered his things, his current book, his notebook, the pen he kept in the notebook's spiral, and stood up and pushed his chair in. He looked around the library with the proprietary look of someone who has strong opinions about a place. "I'm going to look at the new periodicals before we leave," he said. "They got an archive issue of the Naval Institute proceedings." "We'll be here," Nora said. He went. They sat at the table, Nora and Damien, in the quiet of the reference section. Outside the window, the afternoon was doing what Portland afternoons did in March. Rain, and then light, and then rain again, the city conducting its business under a sky that couldn't make up its mind and had apparently decided not to bother. "He's going to be fine," Nora said. She said it because she believed it, not because she was trying to convince anyone. "I want you to know that. Whatever the next few years look like with the inquiry and the legal process, he's going to be fine." "I know." Damien looked at his hands on the table. "I keep waiting to feel like I deserve it. That might take a while." "I know that too." She looked at him. The lines at the corners of his eyes were more pronounced than they'd been 3 months ago, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected that the resolution, the conclusion of the thing, would ease something in his face. Instead, it seemed to have deepened it, the way things that have been held under pressure look when the pressure releases. Not broken, just marked. "You made a deal 8 years ago," she said. "You testified to protect the arrangement you had, and then you came in this week and gave them everything else without being asked." She held his eyes. "I'm not keeping score. I'm saying that the person who did the second thing is the person he's going to know."
Damien was quiet for a long moment. He already knows you, she said. He's been researching you for 2 months. He knows more about you than you've told him. A pause. He doesn't hold it against you. Whatever he found, whatever he read, he decided to know you anyway. He's 12. He's also the most clear-eyed person I've ever met. He doesn't do things he hasn't thought through. She looked toward the periodicals room, where they could hear Ethan moving unhurriedly through the stacks. He decided you were worth knowing. You should take that seriously. Damien exhaled. Something in his shoulders that had been held a particular way came down slightly. Not collapse, just the giving up of attention that had been there long enough he'd stopped noticing it. I keep thinking about the platform, he said. At the shipyard. Victor said to come alone, and I went up there, and I spent the whole time aware that if something happened to me, he would find Ethan. He would find him eventually. He paused.
And I also knew that if I didn't go up, whatever Victor had, he would use it, and Ethan gets found anyway. There was no version where playing it safe protected anyone. He looked at the table. That's what 18 years of this life does. It makes every option look like the least bad option. You stop being able to imagine a version where the thing you're trying to protect just... He stopped. Just gets to be safe, she said. Yes. That's what I was trying to give him, she said. When I left, I wasn't trying to punish you. I was trying to find the version where he just got to be safe. She looked at the window. The rain was back, light and persistent. I know it was the wrong call. I know now what it cost you. I've known that for a while, actually. Nora, I'm not apologizing. I made the decision I could make with what I had. I just want you to know I've thought about it. For 13 years, I've thought about it. She looked back at him. And I know it took something from you that you didn't get back. He held her gaze. I'm getting it back, he said. Slowly. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away toward the window, toward the rain on the street outside, toward the ordinary afternoon moving through the ordinary city. He's going to want to come back next Tuesday, she said, and the Tuesday after that. He's going to want you here every time. I'll be here every time. That's a long commitment. Yes, Damien said simply. It is. From the periodicals room came the sound of Ethan setting something down on a reading table, and then his voice, unhurried, matter-of-fact, aimed at the room in general. There's a 1987 issue of the proceedings that has a first-hand account of the Stark incident. That's actually useful for what I'm working on. Nora closed her eyes briefly. Is he narrating to himself or to us? Both, Damien said. I think he does it as a way of thinking. She opened her eyes. How do you know that? Because I do the same thing. He paused. Apparently. She looked at him. Something moved in her face that hadn't been there in a long time, something that didn't have a clean category. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness implied a ledger, and she was done with ledgers, but something adjacent to it, something that acknowledged the length of the road and the fact that they were both still walking it. Come on, she said. She stood. Before he decides, we need to look at the 1987 issue together. Damien stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and looked at the reference section. The long shelves, the table in the corner with the best light, the folder they'd leave at the desk for someone else to sign out. The room smelled of old paper and something else. Something she'd noticed her first week as director and hadn't quite been able to name. Something that every library seemed to have underneath the obvious smells. The smell of accumulated attention, maybe. Of all the hours people had sat in these rooms and thought carefully about things. He looked at it for a moment like a man memorizing something. Then they walked together toward the periodicals room, where their son was reading about a 1987 naval incident on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The rain coming down outside in that patient, persistent Portland way. The library holding them the way it held everything. Quietly, carefully, without asking anything in return. Ethan looked up when they came in. This part, he said, pointing at a paragraph, is wrong. The timeline is off by 6 hours. There's a better source in the reference section. He looked at Damien. I can show you. Damien looked at his son, pointing at a paragraph in a 30-year-old naval periodical on his 13th birthday, in the library where he'd found him, where all of this had started and was now, in its own complicated way, continuing. Show me, Damien said. Ethan stood up, tucked the periodical under his arm, and walked back toward the reference section. They followed him. The library settled around them in the late afternoon. Warm, quiet, the rain on the windows, the lights over the shelves doing what lights in libraries do, which is make everything they touch look like it's worth keeping, look like it has already survived something and has more to say. Ethan stopped at the shelf he wanted and ran his finger along the spines until he found what he was looking for. And he pulled it out and set it on the nearest table and opened it and looked at the page and said, "Here," in the voice of someone who has found the thing they were looking for and expects the world to find it as satisfying as they do. Damien bent over the table beside his son and looked at the page. Outside, the rain continued its patient work on the city. The shelves stood in their long rows holding everything that had been put in them for safekeeping. And in the reference section of the East Side Community Library, on a Tuesday in March, the man who had once been feared across the underworld stood next to his 13-year-old son and read about a naval timeline and did not think about the platform, or the waterfront, or the federal conference room, or the long undoing of the thing he had built, but only about the page in front of him and the boy beside him, and the question Ethan was already forming about the next paragraph, which was the only question that mattered now, which was the only territory left worth knowing. "Dad," Ethan said, finger on the text, "can we come back next Tuesday?" Damien straightened up. He put his hand on his son's shoulder. Not the firm, redirecting pressure of that first night in the farmhouse kitchen, but something quieter, something that didn't need to move anything anywhere, something that was just present. "Yes," he said. "We can come back next Tuesday." The library held them. The rain came down. The afternoon ended the way good things end, not with resolution that erases everything that came before it, but with the particular piece of people who have paid the full price for where they are and know it and stay anyway, in the warm light, among the books, together.